Hi, everybody. Welcome. Bonjour, bienvenue. Thank you for being here. We're just letting folks in. If you can, we'd love it if you take a moment and maybe introduce yourself in the chat. I'm going to do that now. Hi, Lola. Nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us. Hi, David. Hi, Cameron. David, I'm going to wait for your signal to tell me when to start, even though I don't see you, but maybe you can message me. Hi, Susan. Thank you for joining us. Hi, Alex. I'm also in Montreal. Maybe some people are online. That's great. That was a message just to me, but I'll share with everybody. So do you want me to start? Maybe we'll give it 1 minute if that works. Okay, everybody's coming in with the hellos. This is great. Thank you. If you're just joining us, please don't be shy. We'd love you to add your name and organization in the chat box. For those, if you're new to Zoom or haven't used it in a while, it's the chat function just at the bottom of your screen. On my screen, it's in the middle. I think everybody should be very ready. Oh, Hussein from Turkey. That's amazing. Welcome. I wish I knew how to say welcome in Turkish. That's so great. I'm sorry. I know I've missed a few people who've been dropping your name and your organization in the chat box, but we're really glad everybody's here. If you're on the East Coast, it's your lunchtime. Hi, Christine. Nice to see you. Okay. I'm going to suggest that we get started and then folks can continue 1 minute. Okay, that's what David just told me. Oh, Andreas, you raised your hand. Okay, that's great. Andreas, do you have a question? Maybe the hand went down. Oh, originally Sudanese, but located in Turkey. Okay. I hope Turkey's treating you well. I don't know where in Turkey you are, but not an easy time. Okay, David, I'm going to suggest that we get started. Okay, so hi everybody, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Chad Lebelski, je suis avec Bénévole Canada. Moi, je suis ici à Montréal, so I'm Chad Lebelski with Volunteer Canada, and we're just getting started. So thank you so much for attending our Changemakers at Work webinar, where today we're talking about all things National Volunteer Week, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. And so our goals today are to identify the best practices for engaging employees in National Volunteer Week. And this conversation will feature different perspectives and highlight the challenges many volunteer centers and nonprofits face, but also how corporate partners can help be part of the solution. So with that, I do very sincerely want to say good morning and good afternoon, wherever you might happen to be on Turtle Island. And we at Volunteer Canada would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are each on across these great lands. And so while we meet on a virtual platform, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the important Indigenous history attached to these lands, which we each call our home. At Volunteer Canada, we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and ceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that call this land home. And so I myself am in Montreal, or Tshaka, which has been a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people since time immemorial. And I would also want to say that, this is It's an important week for many of us. It's Passover for some of us, so Chag Sameach. It's Easter, Joyous Pâques, Happy Easter, and it's also Ramadan. And so if folks on the call are celebrating any of those or anything else, we really hope this is a time of reflection and renewal for you. And we very much appreciate you joining during what we know is a very busy time. And I would also add, oh great, hello from Morocco, bienvenue. That today's webinar is in English, but people can participate in the language of their choice. And I'm just going to flag for David, who's behind the scene helping with logistics. But David, I'm not really able to follow what's going on in the chat. So if there is something that I need to see, maybe send me a quick Teams message or even the text, because I think I'm more likely to see that. Okay, so maybe I'll ask for the next slide. With that. Okay, so I'm just going to say a quick word on Volunteer Canada. In case everybody's not familiar with us, we provide national leadership on expertise on volunteer engagement to increase the participation, quality, and diversity of volunteer experiences. We work closely with volunteer centers, businesses, nonprofit organizations, government, and educational institutions to promote and broaden volunteering. Our programs, research, training, tools, resources, and national initiatives provide leadership on issues and trends in Canada's volunteering and participation landscape. And so before we go any further, we want to throw up a poll for you to tell us about some of your biggest barriers to participating in National Volunteer Week. Okay, the poll is up. I think folks should be able to see it. So we're curious to better understand some of your barriers to participating in National Volunteer Week. So you can see there's organizational capacity, lack of knowledge, unsure of the first steps, unable to commit financially, and then other. Oh, okay, people are really filling out the poll. This is awesome, thank you. And just to get a sense, we have a series of questions for each of the panelists, so I'm going to introduce in a second. And this might help guide them as they better understand your barriers to participating in National Volunteer Week. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we keep going forward as people continue to fill out the poll. And I'm just going to flag that all of a sudden I have lots of windows open on my screen. Oops, and I just expanded that, which I didn't want to do. Okay, so we have many participants on the call today who are part of Volunteer Canada's Corporate Community Engagement Council, affectionately internally of Volunteer Canada. We refer to it as the CCAC. So and our speaker, Shauna Peddle from the Cooperatives Group, is part of the council. And the council is comprised of Canadian companies committed to advancing the practice of corporate volunteering, giving, learning, and other civic activities in order to create stronger communities, as well as growth, development, and engagement for employees, and a skilled and empathetic and caring workforce for companies. This leadership and learning group and community brings together a diverse and talented group of practitioners from council companies to generate and promote thought leadership, corporate community engagement practices. So I'm going to quickly introduce everybody. Our first speaker is Kathy Brothers. Welcome, Kathy. Thank you for joining us. For more than 50 years, Kathy has enjoyed senior governance and leadership positions within the charitable sector. Since 2010, Kathy has been the founding CEO of Capacity Canada, where she's committed to growing social good throughout Canada's collaboration, optimism, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Kathy is passionately committed to innovative ideas, risk-taking, and helping individuals, organizations, communities, and systems reach their maximum potential. Welcome, Kathy. We also have Jane Henning. Jane is the Executive Director of Volunteer Waterloo Region, which provides services that strengthen the capacity of over 170 charity and nonprofit organizations to engage and support volunteers. Jane is past chair of the Volunteer Canada Board. Thank you for your service, Jane, and has served on many local, provincial, and national boards for over 40 years. Jane currently provides sector leadership through her work with the Ontario Volunteer Sector Network and is host of the Executive Directors Network in the Waterloo Region and through community leadership work directly stemming from her ED position. Jane continuously works to demonstrate the value of community engagement locally and beyond, and Jane holds degrees from the University of Calgary and Wilfrid Laurier. Shauna Peddle is our final speaker. Shauna is a partnership broker, collaborator, and convener of like minds to address complex social issues. She has expertise in program design and implementation related to community resiliency, risk communication, environmental risk assessment, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. In her current role, Shauna oversees community investment programs and partnerships with Cooperators, which is a financial services cooperative, including corporate giving and volunteerism, the Cooperative Development Program, the Advisory Community Fund, and the Cooperators Community Fund. Shauna holds a Master's of Forestry, which is awesome, from the University of Toronto, and a graduate diploma in Social Responsibility and Sustainability from St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. Okay, we have some pretty amazing speakers, so we're going to hand them over to them pretty soon. I've been talking a lot. I'll just reiterate that today's webinar is focusing on 3 learning objectives, which we'll hope you'll take away from our conversation. And you see them up there on the screen. We want to identify ways National Volunteer Week can help you build a volunteering participation and contribution movement. We want to understand the benefits of engaging in National Volunteer Week, and then how we might we integrate those into our practices all year. And we want to understand the crossroads that volunteering is currently experiencing, and how best to support capacity building and engagement moving forward. So to help us better frame the conversation, my colleague Alyssa is going to quickly walk us through what National Volunteer Week is. So I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you, David, for inviting me here today. So as Chad mentioned, I just want to take a few moments of your time today to share with you what is National Volunteer Week, a little bit about the history of National Volunteer Week, and this year's theme. So National Volunteer Week is a public campaign where we get to celebrate and thank over 24 million volunteers who give their time and their talents in formal and informal ways across the country and in their local communities. It's also an opportunity for us to raise awareness about the work that volunteers do and their valuable contributions. So I'm brand new to Volunteer Canada. I'm the Director of Engagement and Membership Services, and I was really curious to know when National Volunteer Week started. And I was shocked to find out that National Volunteer Week is a 80-year-old tradition. Next slide, please. It was first celebrated in 1943, and it began as an event to enlist women for wartime volunteer service. And so about 20 years later, volunteer centers across Canada had the idea of having an annual week to honor Canadians and Canada's volunteers. And this week really started to grow in the 70s and the 80s. And then in 1990, Volunteer Canada proclaimed National Volunteer Week to be held in April in all communities across the country. And this is really a time for all of us to intentionally recognize the contributions and the impact that volunteers have in their communities. So every year there's a theme, and this year's theme for National Volunteer Week is Volunteering Weaves Us Together. And if you can't see my background, we are celebrating this week April 16th to April 22nd. And what this reveals is the importance of volunteering to the strength and the vibrancy of our communities through the interconnected actions that we take to support one another. And all the many forms of sharing our time, of our talent and our energy, it really reinforces the fabric of our community. And so, as Chad mentioned, the mission at Volunteer Canada is really to increase the participation, quality, and diversity of volunteer experiences. And this public campaign really gives us the opportunity to promote volunteerism, to raise awareness about volunteers, and to recognize the wide-ranging contributions of volunteers. And this is a time where we really want to showcase all Canadians who are putting their values into action every day. And so if you go to our website, volunteer.ca, we have lots of resources for you to support and celebrate this campaign. You'll see social media, content banks, tip sheets. We have campaign banners, posters, thank you cards, a certificate of appreciation, web banners. And we also have an online store with volunteer recognition items for purchase. And so that, in a nutshell, is National Volunteer Week. And on the last slide, I do want to also share with you another program, Canada's Volunteer Awards. And this is a program from Employment and Social Development Canada. And this program, this Canada's Volunteer Awards, really recognizes volunteers, not-for-profit organizations, businesses, social enterprises for their contributions across the country. And the call for nominations is open, and it's open until April 26th. And what I would really like for you to do is to go to canada.ca/volunteer-awards to nominate somebody who you feel is making a difference. And this could be a group of volunteers, it could be an individual, or it can be a business leader who's really making a difference in their community to receive an award. And there is one national award for an individual who has volunteered for at least 20 years. And then there are also 20 regional awards, which includes a business leader award. And so with the awards, the recipients will be recognized at a ceremony with a certificate signed by the Prime Minister, and they will also receive a pin. And so I really appreciate you listening to me. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me directly at able@volunteer.ca. And that's it. And I hand it back to you, Chad.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Lisa. Merci, miigwech. So I'm happy to share that we're 5 minutes ahead of schedule. So that's great. And if you've just joined us, we're asking folks to drop their name and their organization and maybe where they are in the chat. It's always nice to see who's on the call. So this next phase of the presentation, I'm going to be asking our panelists some questions. And then we'll do a tour de table, we'll do a go around, and then we're going to open it up for your questions as well. I will quickly want to say I did see the note in the Q&A about volunteering, about foreign volunteers, and maybe I might suggest we can take that at the end of the session, or maybe even offline. Alyssa, who just gave her email, might be able to help with that. So that's Blais, BLAIS, at volunteer.ca. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go to the questions. So the first question is, why does your organization support National Volunteer Week and believe in the importance of raising awareness about it across Canada? So let's do this in alphabetical order by first name. So we'll go to Kathy, and then Jane, and Shana.
Hey, I'm the Kathy part of this team, so I'm pleased to start off the responses to the question. Thank you, Chad, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to prepare with you for a rousing success of this year's National Volunteer Week. That Capacity Canada that I head up is a national organization, and we work with nonprofits all across Canada. And, you know, there's a huge reason why this National Volunteer Week is so important to us, and that we have supported it wholeheartedly over the years, is that every single nonprofit organization in Canada has volunteers. That in order to be incorporated, you have to have a board of directors. The board of directors are made up of volunteers. So no matter what your subject matter or how, you know, how much volunteers are a part of other parts of the organization, the board of every organization is made up of a minimum of 3 volunteers. That means, or 3 board members. That means there's over 1 million board members in Canada. Their role in the future, the strategy, the sort of whole evolution of our organizations is absolutely fundamental to us being able to do more good in the communities. So we support the National Volunteer Week because it really gives us an opportunity to both recognize the board members who are volunteers across the country, but also to absolutely emphasize the importance of educating, coaching, mentoring, and supporting those people, both individually and as whole boards. So I better stop here because everybody has to have a chance to jump in.
That's great. Thanks, Kathy. Over to you, Jane.
Yeah, it's very nice to be here today, and volunteer centers across the country, I'm sure will echo that volunteers are vital to the infrastructure of services and programs across the country. And I think too often we take for granted that the volunteers will be there. And when we throw out numbers like 24 million volunteers, whether they be formal or informal, that is a significant impact. And back in 2018, the Conference Board of Canada put out a paper with the support of Volunteer Canada on the work impact and the economic contribution of volunteers. And it's massive, when you think about the 2.9% or 2.7% of the GDP is just the work contribution of volunteers in this country. And so I love the theme for National Volunteer Week this year about the weaving us together, because if you think of a fabric and how strong it is, but if a thread's broken, it weakens the fabric and it starts fraying. And so we think about the importance of volunteers and the roles they play in our community and across the country. We see how very important every single thread is. So thanking our volunteers during National Volunteer Week. We know that volunteers are motivated in as many ways as there are volunteers, but this 1 week gives us the opportunity to really focus on the contribution of volunteers. And I think for us as volunteer centers, for Volunteer Canada, raising the awareness of the importance of volunteers is a vital part of that this week, because it helps the rest of our country, the public, the politicians, the employers, so many of you on the phone today or on the line today, understand how vital those volunteer contributions are. And just to pat the corporate folks on the back that are on the call today, we know that that's a growth area and growth potential in terms of volunteer engagement, and how important that is in a time period when we post-pandemic are seeing declines in volunteer engagement. So thank you everybody who's on the line that is volunteering out in the community.
Thanks, Jane. Sana.
Hi, everybody. We are a financial services organization. So we do insurance, we do investments, we do advice, but we're also a cooperative. And that for us is something that we all bring to work every day, is that concern for community. The entire purpose of our organization is to protect people, to meet unmet needs in our communities. So for us, it's incredibly important to support National Volunteer Week because our people are throughout the country. We have 6,000 employees. We also have 600 offices across the country. So if you've ever seen a little cooperator's office somewhere, they know their communities and they're responding to their local needs. So giving our staff any opportunity and supporting that ability to give back in any way that's meaningful to them, not in a way that's meaningful to us as an organization, me as Shauna, but what's important to them and how can they best give back in their own communities. And I'm happy to say that we haven't had a decline in volunteering post-COVID. We did obviously dip down from about 50% to about 16% during the actual pandemic closure period, but we're back up to about 32% of our staff across the country are volunteering. And I think it's because of the value system that we bring to work every day, that concern for each other and concern for community, and actually doing things that make a difference, both inside and outside the building. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. a real diversity of answers there. It's one of the things in looking through the chat, I don't know if folks have gone and scrolled through the chat and seen who's on the call, but it's not surprising to hear that diversity of answers, because the folks on the call, there's a real diverse, we're in a real beautiful assembly of folks on this call, which I think really speaks to the vibrancy of the movement. And one thing that I might want to share is a theme that I think I heard throughout what everybody said was the importance of volunteers. And that's something that often, we nod our heads, we all understand that. But one of the things that we're seeing, and, hats off to the cooperators that hasn't seen the decline in volunteering, during National Volunteer Week, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there actually is a decline in volunteering in Canada. And one of the reasons that we're seeing is that even though we all agree on the importance of volunteers, there can be a lack of understanding on the infrastructure and the resources that are needed to support volunteers. And that can be significant. And so that's one of the things that the Volunteer Canada we're thinking about, and I know many volunteer serving organizations are as well. So that unintentionally was a bit of a lead-in to the second question, which is, what are you finding to be the biggest engagement driver of volunteerism, and what growth challenges have you experienced? So biggest driver and growth challenges. And this time I'm going to suggest that we start with Jane, and then we'll go to Shauna, and then we'll close out with Kathy.
Yeah, so I want to dwell on the positive, but I will start with, we are seeing the decline at the local level in volunteerism, not maybe as large as some centers. So I'm happy about that locally, but really understanding what motivates the volunteer is really important. And there's a shift post, pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID. So, I think when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking in all of those terms. We had an infrastructure, and I'll keep referring to that in this country, because we've built this whole, and Kathy referred to it, every organization that is a charity or nonprofit has to have volunteers, whether they are board members or they help with the everyday operations. And each volunteer is motivated in a different way. And before COVID, or leading into it, there was a lot of focus on skills development, employment readiness, or in resume enhancing, team building. It was as much as the number one reason why people got involved was to give back to community. The secondary or the subgroups under that were motivated by things that were, enhancing their own well-being, as well as the well-being of community. So there was balance, which was really good. During COVID, of course, we saw surge volunteering, where, when a wave would hit, there would be a lot of volunteers, and it would potential volunteers coming in and saying, what can we do to help? What can we do to help? And of course, during a pandemic, that's a lot harder than in other emergency situations, because you're trying to keep people apart. But there was, so when there was a wave of issues, there's a wave of volunteer interest. Coming out of COVID, I think what we're seeing is that people are really looking more at the organizations and what they're doing, at least here locally. When we're looking at, pre-COVID, people went right on our site to the positions and looking at the skills they could donate or build through a volunteer role. Now, the number one thing that they're opening is the page of the organization to learn about what that organization is doing for the community, the impact they're making, that and so understanding how their contribution will fit into the end game, right? The impact for the community. So I think really, as we recognize volunteers and the contribution they're making, helping volunteers to see their role within those organizations becomes really more and more important. and what are they contributing. So that's, a very broad and long answer to your question, Chad, but I think that the motivations right now are changing, and we're learning a lot right now as we move forward out of the pandemic.
Thanks, Jane. Not so broad, actually quite specific. Shauna, over to you.
Thanks, Jane. That was actually really informative for me, and I'll try to frame my answer in response to that. So I think that for us, probably the biggest engagement driver of volunteerism is that we just keep talking about it. So it's not just during volunteer week for us. It is throughout the year. It is in the summer. It is in the winter. It's all throughout. And we try to connect it back to some of the organizations that we support, like for cooperative youth leader camps, for example, if they need facilitators. We talk about what volunteering means and what giving back means. And then towards the end of the year, we talk about it in terms of other things that we're doing. So I think it's that kind of continuous discussion. And the support of our volunteers and action committees. So we have committees, about 6 or 8 of them across the country, that are dialed into their local volunteer needs, and then they work within their bigger, that's in our bigger centers where we have a bigger staff population that can really focus on those local needs. I think one of the biggest things that we did in terms of engagement and support of our staff is to not make volunteering specific to corporate goals. So we don't have a day of volunteering where we gather all of our teams and we go out once a year. We do have some small partnerships that support that, but the vast majority of the time is us supporting our staff to do what's meaningful for them and give back in a way that is reflective of their needs, their communities, and their own lives. We don't track. We don't have, which organization are you volunteering for? We don't ask those questions. We may eventually. It does make it difficult for us to communicate impact beyond hours and time and staff numbers. But I think that there's an understanding that if you're going to bring your best self to work, then we should support you to be your best self outside of work as well. So all of our staff get 2 days a year to volunteer. And then beyond that, they can do anything they want in their local communities. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is exactly what Jane was just talking about understanding our staff and where they want to volunteer and what motivates them to volunteer, but also what volunteer opportunities are out there in communities. We don't know what we don't know. And being a smaller staff that's located in Guelph, Ontario, we don't know what the needs are across the country. So trying to forge those relationships and get a feel for what we can direct our staff to and the opportunities that we can put on our volunteer websites, for example, to be able to connect people to local opportunities. I think that that's a challenge that we are looking for ways to overcome as well.
Thank you, Shauna. Kathy.
I'll learn to unmute eventually by the end of this session. That as both Jane and Shauna spoke, I kept changing what I want to say, so it's harder to go third than first because I want to comment on everything you both said. From our point of view, and I think this is shared by the volunteer action centers and volunteer centers across Canada as well as nationally, our biggest challenge is keeping up with all the opportunities. That there are incredible partnerships between corporations and nonprofits that, revolve around more community service and engagement. There's been such a change in the way that we all do business. I was just reading on my favorite LinkedIn this morning about, it's 50 years since the cell phone was invented. For many people, they've never known life where you didn't have a cell phone. I was already working in the field, but we didn't have cell phones. And you can imagine the difference. Like just thinking of that one piece of technology that's just like 8-year-olds are walking around now with their own, cell phones. But the changes that has brought about in the way we do business, it's 10 or 20 years ago, the whole way that boards operated changed. We used to look for volunteers that were prepared to give time, that cared about the cause, but we didn't really look at what their role was in terms of strategy and generative thinking and, you know, the oversight of the organization. When I started reporting to boards or being on boards, most boards thought they were there to help out the CEO or do some extra, you know, volunteer work. Nowadays, we're so clear on the roles and responsibilities of board members in terms of looking at the future of organizations that it brings in a whole different skill set. So I think the challenges are all very exciting ones because they go along with the sort of changes that are taking place in the larger world. You know, that I've been around sort of long enough, and I always like to admit that I worked with volunteers in hospitals where they were delivering flowers, delivering mail. Nowadays, nobody's in a hospital long enough to receive flowers or mail, but that's beside the point. We don't do things like that anymore. Now the volunteers are doing highly tech and, you know, lots and lots of relationship kind of things that are way beyond what we would have thought of in years past. So, you know, I can still remember the time that somebody came to me as a nonprofit and asked if we had some volunteer work that they could do. And then they said, I want something that I can do with my brain and not my hands. Like what I'm offering you is my brain, you know, and I have, you know, all kinds of skills that they went on to talk about. They also didn't want to show up at 4 o'clock every Wednesday when it's time to move the chairs. They wanted to have a project that they could work with on their own time and with the skills they had to offer. People in volunteer centers are very used to that kind of profile of a volunteer now, but that was new, you know, not that many years ago. So, you know, when we look at the engagement driver, the biggest one is still the country is full of people that want to do good. Mostly, they don't know how to do it, you know? Like I have a neighbor who's an older woman who walks our dog as a volunteer a couple days a week because she likes going in the nearby park. And she always has a pocket full of money that she gives to people in the park that look like they could use a coffee. She also brings lunch every day for one of the park people. To me, that's a volunteer. Nobody in the world knows that she's volunteering. She doesn't even consider herself a volunteer. She's just doing things that a good person does. So I think in terms of growth challenges and how we reframe and recognize the country, like I just want to repeat it because it's so important, is full of good people wanting to do good. And we see that through organizations all across the country. So how do we like support that good? How do we make sure that if people have roles that require particular skills, like on a board, that it becomes a learning opportunity, not just a giving opportunity for the board members? You know, Shauna, when you described how cooperators is engaged, like we just find over and over that the corporates are really looking for ideas on how their employees can give back to the community. And when we help place those employees on boards, what we say, like to the president or vice president level, like, how come you needed us to do this? Surely you could pick up the phone and there's hardly any nonprofit that wouldn't want you on their board. And they say, I wouldn't have a clue where to start. I wouldn't have a clue where to start. And if I call out of the blue, people are going to think I'm some kind of a nut bar that, it hasn't really got the best interest of their organization at heart. So I think in terms of the challenges, it's like all the people of goodwill and how do you do the matching? And some of the traditional ways that volunteer centers always did it with just having, lists and lists of information, they've long discovered don't really like they've gone the way, of the landlines.
Yeah, Kathy, sorry, I just want to, because I agree with you. I think that's exactly what volunteer managers and program managers are experiencing. And those, for the people out in the audience today, understanding that those descriptions of volunteer roles that exist are a starting place. I think many volunteer managers have already transitioned to being more of a negotiator, a designer in terms of what that role is in the end, and you know, recognizing those good people who are doing the walking of the dogs in the park. I love that story, by the way. That's so valuable. And yet, how do we transition? And this is what I think the whole sector is trying to figure out is, we know that they're there. We have a whole sector of formal volunteering that is shifting and redesigning. How do we help transition some of those informal volunteers into the formal roles? Because, you know, our whole country would be going, where is this service? And what's happened to it if we don't have those volunteers in the formal setting? So finding that balance is huge. And so I appreciate, thank you for bringing up the informal volunteering, because I think that's really important to recognize as well.
Yeah, and you know, you're like the whole volunteer network, I mean, is so strengths-based, so I don't want to undermine or insult that. But you know, the poll today in terms of what gets in the way of people supporting national volunteer work was full of, like, I would like, that kind of poll drives me nuts, because like, it's full of a list of problems. You know, like a more interesting poll is, you know, what's helping you to celebrate, like, you know, like what are the positive things, like, you know. And I think that there's a kind of a, you know, before long you can sort of start singing the same song as everybody else just because you've heard it so often, even if you don't know what the words mean, you know. And that there's a common misbelief that there's less interest in volunteerism than there ever was. People have more time and more gifts in terms of education and life experience than ever. I think that, you know, rather than the messages that we often give out in terms of, you know, the volunteer bases being depleted, we need to give a message of it's changing, it's growing, there's more opportunities than ever. We just have to read any front page of any newspaper in well, probably globally, and see the problems related to homelessness and poverty. There's no way that we can solve those issues without whole communities being involved. So, you know, the message is there is so much out there that needs your attention as a volunteer. And here, you know, like, how do we keep evolving the way we engage people? Like, that's like not looking at where did they all go? That's a lost cause. Like, it's more like they're all here. Now, how the heck do we really engage them in meaningful ways?
That's that whole
Perfect.
transitioning piece, right?
Perfect.
It's absolutely, yeah.
I would wholeheartedly agree that that is the key question. And thank you for that robust discussion. There's just a few quick thoughts that come to mind, and maybe even just to peel back the curtain a little bit for, you know, Kathy, thank you for your constructive feedback about the poll. It made me realize, one, that I didn't share the results. So I'm doing that now. I don't know if folks can see it. Maybe nod your head if you see it, gives a sense. And two, just to turn the curtain, you know, a Volunteer Canada, we asked ourselves some questions here around National Volunteer Week, because there is so much to celebrate about what is going on in the country, but there are some challenges, right? And we don't want to be Pollyannish about it either. And so what is the right balance to strike in April 2023? I'm not certain we know, and I'm not suggesting that we've figured it out either, right? But maybe just to say that it is an open question for us at Volunteer Canada as we think about, you know, what is the communication, what is the messaging, and what is really the line of inquiry and curiosity. You know, from the conversation, I definitely took away this, you know, the only constant is change, right? Change in our motivation, change in who's participating, change in organizational structure, things of that nature. I also took away, you know, that story in the park. I had the feeling that this woman who does that gets a strong sense of purpose and inclusion and belonging from that, right? So it's not actually just about giving back, right? You know, I don't remember, I think it was Jane, I think you used the word balance. right? And talking about volunteering, sometimes we talk about reciprocity, things of that nature, and really understanding the motivation. So the world of volunteering and participation and contribution is changing. And how best do we adapt to that? And locally, we're seeing that happen. But it's fascinating that people want to participate and don't know how. It feels almost counterintuitive, but we know that quite empirically, even if the data is murky on some other things. So we've got time very quickly for one more question. I'm going to ask the panelists to just say the one thing, one quick answer to this one, because we do want to get to the Q&A. So this last question is, when it comes to volunteering, what do you know now that you wished you knew before? And it's just one thing. And I'm not remembering the order. I think we're doing Jane, Shauna, Kathy. Is that right?
I think Sean is first this
Shauna
time.
is first? Okay, perfect. So let's do Shauna, Kathy, Jane.
That conversation set me up perfectly for the one thing I wish I knew before. I
Great.
wish that I knew what organizations need their volunteers to do. I grew up in very formal, we're going to work at a soup kitchen. We're going to do this one thing for this 2 hours this afternoon and then never come back. I wish I knew what I knew now about this extended opportunity for volunteering, the skills-based volunteering, project-based volunteering, longer-term relationships that aren't simply a photo op. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Kathy.
On a personal level, one of my most rewarding experiences as a volunteer has been as a Rotarian. And one of the things I learned as a Rotarian is the amount of fun and fellowship that's involved in the volunteering. So although we're often challenged to find, and I think it's the same, Shauna, with often the corporations, the challenge of finding an activity that people can wholeheartedly kind of participate in. But there's lots of them out there. And I think if I had known, and I know now, and it's influenced a lot of what I do, but I'd have been a lot more involved myself as a volunteer if I knew how much fun and fellowship that it actually entailed.
That's an awesome segue for me, because I've been a volunteer all my life, as long as I can remember. I have volunteered, and I'm not even in the womb, I think, basically. I mean, we've just something my parents have encouraged us to do since we were very, very small. And so I talk about volunteerism. I'm executive director at a volunteer center. But what I really wish I could do better and is to help volunteers blow their own horn. I wish that I could better get volunteers to talk about how they volunteer, what they do, why it's important, why volunteers don't talk about themselves. They don't pat themselves on the back. They don't, there's a lot of them that don't even want to be recognized for what they're doing, but it's so valuable for helping people to know where to volunteer, helping them to understand what's out there that they could be doing, helping them to realize their own talents and their own gifts that they could be sharing. If people would talk more about what they do as a volunteer. I have been volunteering on boards for over 40 years. I have pushed seniors from their rooms into social activities in nursing homes. There's just such a broad list of, I remember the first week I started at the volunteer center, learning about an ice cream vendor for one of the nursing homes, and a joke teller, which I thought my dad would love it. I don't know that anyone else would want to hear it. He's the world's worst joke teller, but there's such variety of things that you can do, and to just share what you're doing is so important. And so helping people to really speak about their own experiences. Like Kathy loved the story of the lady in the park. Wouldn't it be great if more people just sort of took cash in their pockets for wouldn't have to be walking in the park, maybe, going for a coffee somewhere and there's somebody outside. So there's all kinds of things that we can do if we knew about it.
That's great. Thank you. I hadn't thought about that. Communication is key. Absolutely. So we have about 10 minutes. I saw that some folks had posed some questions in the chat and some participants had answered others' questions, I think, as I'm seeing it go through, which is amazing. There's a lot of expertise on this call. So if your question has been answered in the chat, that's great. If it hasn't, I would encourage you to use the Q&A function, because that way I will definitely see your question. So we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I'm just gonna, some of them are a little bit long, so I'm gonna just paraphrase it if I might. And for the panelists, I don't know if you all need to answer the question, but if one of you have an answer and want to step forward, then that would be great. So there's a question from somebody on the call who had an experience as a volunteer where they were at a festival and they were told to remove a rainbow sticker from a volunteer ID badge because it was considered branding. And so curious to understand what if your organization has policies around how volunteers present themselves, but also, on a meta level, what would you say is best practice or wisest practice for organizations when they want to support volunteers to show up fully for their roles?
I can probably comment on that one. If
Sure.
somebody is wearing a cooperator's shirt and they want to wear a rainbow badge, they're welcome. Please wear your rainbow badge. If you can't bring your whole self to a volunteer event, why would you bring your whole self to work, and why would you feel safe in either place? So please. Yep.
Yeah, Sean, I like your answer, because it's a sad question that we're asking that question in 2023. Like, it shouldn't even be a question anywhere. And we think sometimes we're so far past the point where we can, individuals don't feel safe to celebrate their own identities. And I think we just have to convey, in all kinds of ways, that whoever organized that, festival lost control of somebody. Like, that should never have happened. It's inexcusable, and we shouldn't start making policies around it. Like the whole, message of inclusiveness just says this is wrong, wrong, wrong.
I see lots of head nodding.
Depending on the event, I'd make everybody wear a rainbow pin. I'd bring a box of rainbow pins.
So we've got a bunch of other questions, which I'm going to try and get to. Jane, is that okay? I saw you were about to step in, but it's okay if we go to the other questions?
Go ahead.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so any recommendations for small businesses to get involved in Volunteer Week that may not have the capacity or the funds, but yet want to be involved?
So I would be happy to say that there are volunteer centers across the country who have volunteer roles with thousands of organizations. I think the connections with volunteer centers is about 8,500 organizations, all of them using volunteers. So there's always ways to get involved in events. They will post events on their sites. They will post volunteer roles. They will post activities and celebrations that are happening around volunteerism. So there should be lots of ways. I would encourage you to look for your local volunteer center.
Any other thoughts on that question? Oh, that's okay. We've got a few more questions. Okay. If you do have a thought, maybe just drop it into the chat. So this is a question specific for Shauna. How can the local not-for-profit sector make it easier for a corporate volunteer initiative to collaboratively celebrate National Volunteer Week?
So for a local, I'm just trying to find the question myself. So for a local nonprofit to work with a corporate partner to
That's
be able
how
to do
I
that?
understand it. Yes.
I think that the companies like ours, we have a an email, community@cooperators.ca. I think most will. Most of the bigger companies should have something like that. They should have a team of people who are working in this space. You can find them, and I think just reach out. I think that if remember as well that corporations can't support everything. So most of us do have a focus, and we do have certain things that we have to say no to simply because we can't do everything, not because it's not wonderful. So if you can go onto a website, see if there's an alignment, call us up. We are wonderful people. We do this for a reason, and we love to talk. So we're happy to talk to people. If we have to say no, sometimes we can suggest somebody else. If it's not us, then who? So if that's one way to do it. I think if you are in active partnership with a corporation, then that conversation should be happening regularly anyway. And they ask a corporation, can you help us? We need help. We don't ask the question enough of our partners. So if you need help, please ask us. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm on mute.
Can I finish? Can I finish for one more point?
Of course.
Sorry, one even better way to celebrate is to offer to do lunch and learns, staff training, staff education with your corporate partners. That is the one thing that we are working on now and moving forward is our staff don't know what the needs are in our communities. So how can we partner with our partners? So it's not me talking about it. It's one of our community partners who's talking about the need and what is actually happening and how we can help to support. So raising that awareness and creating corporate citizens is the only way I can put it, who are knowledgeable and engaged and want to give back because we've explained exactly what those needs and the opportunities are.
Oh, I love that. That's great. It makes me think of the value of conversation guides to get that work started, right? Maybe something that Volunteer Canada might be able to do. I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but that's great. Okay, a very practical question. Is there somewhere I can go to get a list of all the volunteer centers in Ontario? And I might add Canada. I don't know somebody on the call. I'm a bit gêné. I'm a bit embarrassed that I don't have an answer to that question. Like we would have a list of all the Volunteer Canada members, but I don't know about all the volunteer centers.
Volunteer Canada does have access to volunteer centers on their website. So, and the provincial organizations will, like the Ontario Volunteer Center Network, will have listings of volunteer centers across the province. So there's and just Google volunteer center in your community as well. So any of those will be ways to find volunteer centers.
Okay.
Oh, it looks like Shaminda.
Yeah, I see lots of, there's
there.
some links being chopped in the chat. So I haven't clicked on them, but I'm hoping they work.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I hope that answers your question. Okay, we're at 4 minutes to the hour. So we do need, or 26 minutes past the hour if you're in Newfoundland. So we do need to wrap up. Maybe I'll just do a very quick go around to the panelists. If there's anything else that they would like to add that we might have missed or that the questions didn't ask to share out about volunteering and National Volunteer Week. Jane, you're circled in yellow on my screen, so I'm going to start with you, then go to Kathy and Shauna.
Okay. Just thank you to everybody online who is a volunteer, and please celebrate what you do during National Volunteer Week, and be open to sharing with others what it is that you do. Not just during National Volunteer Week, at any time, but it is a time when there is a lot of recognition. And also, if you know of groups of organizations that want some connection, again, I encourage you to reach out to your volunteer centers. They're all putting together celebration activities and resources aligned with what's happening at Volunteer Canada. So we're happy to help and get the word out and celebrate.
If I could just add to that, I want to pick up on Shauna's great idea of the lunch and learn, like the sort of offering something that I think that so much of the success and looking at, our topic today around volunteerism and corporate relationships, that I think so much of the success of volunteerism is it has to be a win-win-win. There has to be something in it for the nonprofit. there has to be something in it for the volunteer, and there has to be something in it for the employer or the corporation. That's, supporting community engagement, but, it's not too hard when you think about it, like going back to my, forget the challenges and come up with a model of win, win, win. Because what's good for the nonprofit is good for the volunteer, is good for the corporation. And you could divide that all three ways, but we have to have a mindset of there's no really medals for martyrs. It's got to be win, win, win.
Thanks, Kathy. And then Shauna, closing thoughts.
Closing thought is that Volunteer Week isn't from April 16th to the 23rd. Volunteer Week is every week. And if you keep talking about it and keep reminding people, you're going to catch somebody when they've got some time. You're going to catch people when they're interested. Empower, celebrate, absolutely, but empower and enlighten and encourage as well. So how do you use that celebration time to really rope in the people that are on the fringe of that conversation and really want to join in and just don't know how?
Okay, that's amazing. Okay, we're doing great on time, which is great. So a huge thank you to Jane and Kathy and Shauna and Alyssa as well for your time and contributions. I do want to thank David, who has been the master of puppets behind the scenes. David, I don't know if you're going to be willing to take your camera, show us your face for just 1 second. It's a request. There you are, David. Thank you. Thank you so much for all your help organizing this. Thanks to everybody who joined the call. We'd ask you to keep an eye out for an upcoming Changemakers at Work webinar, which will be held in June. We'd be looking forward to welcoming you back. I'm going to drop this in the chat. No, I don't want to just send that to Volunteer Canada. I want to send it to everybody. This is what I'm supposed to read out, but I'll put it in the chat because I think it might be helpful. More information related to today's conversation, please reach out to corporate citizenship at volunteer.ca, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you again, everybody. Vraiment, merci beaucoup. Miigwech, such a pleasure. Stay well, stay safe, and looking forward to seeing you really soon. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.